Hey everyone, and welcome to HeySummit's live weekly show. I'm Rob from HeySummit, and today I'm excited to have Deldelp Medina join us. Deldelp is the executive director of Black and Brown Founders. She's worked on creating systems for equity in the startup ecosystems for the last 9 years. She has extensive experience stretching from product design to investment and strategy, and has been listed as one of the 6 Latina founders to watch on TechCrunch. Today, she's going to talk to us about her upcoming event, CHROMA, and a whole bunch of other things. So, Del, thank you so much for joining us and for joining me, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you to HeySummit. I'm really excited to talk to you and to talk about HeySummit.
Absolutely. I'd love to just start off with learning a little bit about your journey, your story, and also that of Black and Brown Founders and how they kind of merged and became one.
Yeah, I was the only girl in Alvarado Elementary School here in San Francisco, California. I was a part of the after-school computer club of my generation. I don't think I realized at the time. I think when you're young, you just don't realize the opportunities that are sometimes in front of you. But that was a really great public school. For example, Ruth Osawa, who's a really well-known and renowned artist, was my art teacher, and I interacted a lot with her and would go to her house. And thanks to her, I got a scholarship to study during the summer art. She was a part of that school, but there was also a whole host of other people that were creating opportunities for kids to learn. And I just became really fascinated with computers. And I was also very lucky to live in a neighborhood and to have family relationships where somebody up the street was one of the first editors on PC Magazine. He would have these stacks of PC Magazine, and I would get to read them, right? And that became my love affair with computers. I got my first computer at the age of 16. It was a Commodore 64. It cost as much as a used car at the time, and all my friends thought I was nuts for buying it. They were like, "Why are you spending this money on this thing when you could be buying a car?" Um, and then I became worked at a BBS service when I was just out of high school, and then I became a dot-commer. And I just had an interest in computers, and I just had an interest in figuring out how, because I think there's a lot of puzzle creation and kind of puzzle putting together with technology, and it really hit that part of my brain that was trying to make sense of a world that wasn't necessarily making sense for me, right? And at some point, I just realized that it maybe these systems weren't for me. I wasn't seeing myself reflected. I was a part of a cohort of people that were extremely diverse, and that really lived and worked with a very different ethos than the one we have within technology right now, which is why I'm interested in talking to you about HeySummit and how you're building your company, because I think like there came a point where the commercialization of technology became the forefront rather than the culture making. And I come from people that were about the culture making. I was really a part of an apprenticeship model. I never studied anything formally. Like, mind you, like I would be working and interacting with people who were teaching CS at UC Berkeley. And at no point anybody said to me, go get a computer science degree. But they were teaching me on the side, right? So like HTML1, I literally learned from somebody who was like, hey, let me show you how this works. People who were sysadmins who were like, hey, here's how these systems work. People who were doing freeware and shareware that were like, hey, here's how you think through these things. Um, and so I don't have any formal education in that sense. I just had deep curiosity, and I had people around me that were able to kind of bring me along, for which I was very grateful. But after the dot-com bust, I really just took a look around, and I was like, is this thing for me? I don't know. And so I went into nonprofit work, but inevitably, even though people would hire me for something, like they'd be like, you're a grants officer, you're going to write grants, of which I'm a terrible grant writer, but sometimes. But I would end up redoing their websites. I would end up hiring somebody that would come in and redo the IT systems and working with the IT person to do that. I would work on cybersecurity issues for smaller nonprofits because they didn't have somebody internally and they were getting viruses all the time. So even when I would get hired for something else, I ended up doing tech things. And so I feel like I've always had this pull and push within tech. And so about 10 years ago, more like nine, I got laid off from a nonprofit job that I really loved and in which I thrived. I was working with an indigenous group in the northern part of Mexico on a maternal mortality program. The reason they hired me is that I knew how to run a database that they needed to collect all this data. And at the time, like I had a kid who was small and communication with childcare workers was very difficult. And after I got laid off from that job, my then partner said to me, like, you should go build something. Because at that point I realized like everything was on my whole life was on a phone. And I'm going back and forth between a very, very rural part of Mexico to a more sophisticated urban part of Mexico to San Francisco. And everything's on my phone, all the data that we were gathering, all the interviews we were doing, all the contracts that we had with our partners in Mexico, partners here in the US. Everything was on a phone except one of the most important parts of my life. And so I was like, I haven't built software in forever. I don't know what I'm doing. And I was very lucky to go to a blogger, entrepreneurs. I think it was the first one, and Lisa, and, like they were so welcoming. And then I found this whole group of women in Silicon Valley, and I put together a very rudimentary pitch deck, which is probably very embarrassing if you were to look at it now. And I just was like, okay, let's figure this out. And then I started realizing that while the dot-com bust had happened, a whole bunch of folks that were in financing had come into this world. They had created, and mind you, we're in the middle of a downturn in the United States at that time. We were just climbing out of the downturn post 2008. And people in other parts of this country were really economically hurting, and the Bay Area was booming. And I didn't understand why that boom was, and that boom was really led by Silicon Valley money. I didn't really understand where Silicon Valley money was coming from. Most of it comes from pension funds, excuse me, and other sources that are looking to have outside investments. And since the stock market wasn't rallying, there was a lot of money that was poured into this town. Mm-hmm. And so you seeing suddenly, and I mean that seeing like it went from businesses being shut down in downtown San Francisco and in many other commercial parts of the Bay Area where people were, struggling, like people had lost their houses, people were having a hard time, to suddenly seeing this influx of young people coming into the Bay Area, having new bars and restaurants open up, having new cafes open up, having rents go up very suddenly. And I'm like, what's going on here, right? And thinking like, oh, I could be a part of this. I could create something that people want. And then hitting barrier upon barrier upon barrier where people were either very dismissive, discounting, ignorant, frankly, biased, racist, sexist, homophobic, you name it. I saw it, I experienced it. And that also led me to start thinking, because I was like, okay, what is going on here? How do these systems work? Going back to this puzzle part of my brain that's just like trying
mentality.
To figure out. Yeah, like I'm like, what's going on here? And I was failing. Like I was very much failing. Like at the time, for me to get just an MVP, it required $1 million of capital to be able to build a prototype. Because I needed 6 to 7 developers, a database, creator, 1 to 2 designers. And at that time, putting that all together and paying myself minimal, it would have been $1 million. And people were getting $5 million here, $1 million there, based upon a coffee, like that was the mythos of like, you're going to go to a coffee and somebody's going to hand you $1 million. I went to a lot of coffees. Nobody gave me anything. I got zero. Sometimes they wouldn't even buy the coffee. Okay. So I would have to pay my own coffee. And so I just started asking and going around, and I was failing, and I'm a good speaker. So people would ask me to be on panels. And I would have all these women afterwards come up to me and be like, I want to do what you're doing. And I'd be like, you don't. Like, you don't want to do what I'm doing. I'm failing. Like, this is so bad right now. And it's painful. And I'm having to take on side gigs, and I'm having to do consulting because I still need to pay my rent. I still need to pay my childcare. I still need to pay my insurance. Like, these things still need to happen in my life, right? Um, and it was just really, really hard. And so, long story short, I ended up getting a job at Code 2040, working on a program dealing with entrepreneurship. It's entrepreneurship in residence. The entrepreneur in resident for San Francisco was Ania Williams, and we just started working together. In part because I'm here in San Francisco, and we would meet each other. But I was working actually with 7 people across the U.S. So Nashville, Chicago, Minneapolis, Detroit, North Carolina, and Durham, and here in San Francisco, and Austin. And so I was working with Black and/or Latinx founders who were creating tech companies or tech-enabled companies. And then I was seeing that all the same barriers that had been created here in Silicon Valley had been kind of exported to all these other areas, and that people weren't doing better in these other places. And people had good products, had good services, had traction, and yet like the ball kept on being moved for them. And so working with Ania, it was just amazing, because anybody who's met Ania, who's heard her speak, who's engaged with her, like, Ania is just a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant person. And she has a tenacity and a mindset that very few of us have. She has taught me a lot. And so part of this program required people to actually have some sort of like connection with community. Different people across the country did it in different ways. Some people did meetups on a monthly basis. Some people did mentorship and consultative kind of engagements. People did things in different ways, and Ania decided to put together an event. And that event was the first Black and Brown Founders event. And so she asked me to come and do the keynote, and I went and did the keynote. It was very successful. It was almost sold out. Came together really fast. People were really positive about it. And I just thought, as a part of my job, like, okay, we did that thing. Like, my job continues. I got to go keep on doing this thing. But there was enough need and desire for this event, for like her philosophy and the philosophy around that we're not anti-VC, we're pro-revenue, which then led her to go and be a part of Zebras Unite, which I know that you're a part of really thinking through of what does it look like to create a business that's sustainable, that isn't trying to be $1 billion unicorn at the expense of everybody else. That was the ethos behind it. And, it got spun out. And so when I was laid off from that job, like, she asked me to come along. And so we've been working together for the last couple of years. She's recently moved on to a new position. And so I've come in as executive director of Black and Brown Founders. But it really is about like, how do we help people who have the least amount of resources, but an outsized amount of ambition and intelligence and drive, be able to be successful in creating businesses that are successful, financially successful, is a lot of the work. And that's what actually drives us all, the whole team.
So you talked about puzzles, and you're interested in puzzles. When looking at these wider systems, these giant systems that are out there, it's not just systemic racism that is something that one can obviously fix. There are lots of different puzzles that are there. There's access to capital. There's expectations for that capital. There's getting out of the 9 times out of 10, if you look and sound like me, that coffee is going to probably go very differently than the coffee that you might have had with that investor. So unconscious bias, this unwillingness for people to maybe address systemic issues on the capital side as well as on the founder side. There are all of these types of issues, but it's interesting, like literally in the name, Black and Brown Founders, quite a specific focus on one part of that. And you said just now about how you're trying to equip people with the least amount of resources. Is there a specific reason that you wanted to focus on that side of the challenge rather than trying to look at one of the other areas?
That's a really great question, actually. of the, like, when you're looking at like the system as a whole, so when we look at startup ecosystems, like what is supposed to be an ideal startup ecosystem? Ideal startup ecosystem has good policies, so it has a geographic, whatever geography you're in, has good policies that allow people to easily do things like incorporation, deferring tax payments, hiring and firing of people, maybe tax credits along with that, if not just deference, then actually like tax credits for actually being entrepreneurial. So there's a set of policies that are supposed to enable people to feel comfortable in entrepreneurship. So like that's one thing to know. Then you're supposed to have access to this capital that's supposed to be nimble, that's supposed to be responsive,
open to risk.
Yeah, willing to risk, like that meets certain criteria. In other words, it's not your traditional relationship with a banker that requires assets up front for you to be able to, be able to have access to a line of credit or a loan or something along those lines. So this is a very different sort of thing. And often, as you've heard, I'm sure you've heard a lot of the greats say, yeah, that person who invested in me, with $100,000, when I failed twice, they came back and gave me $1 million because they saw my growth and therefore they saw the opportunity, right? And I would say like those were a lot of the conversations that I would hear. So you have this capital thing, and then you have to have a group of people that are willing to take a risk, be able to start a company. That means that they are going to defer paying themselves or having access to a salary, that have an outsized vision and understanding, that have leadership capabilities. But that risk part is huge. And your ability to take risks comes from a variety of factors: psychological, historical, sociological, geographic base, because if you're living within a place where you're built, like the only way you can get healthcare is through a job, and if you quit that job, you no longer have access to healthcare. But it's not just you, it's you and your family. And if somebody within your family has an ongoing health issue, your chances of actually quitting that job are nil to zero. Like it's not going to happen. So those are the factors that go into supposedly creating a healthy startup ecosystem.
Yeah.
So, but then you look at some of the structural things. Sorry, as a phone call was coming in. Then you look at some of the structural things and you think about like, where are people coming from? So like Black and or Latinx folks earn less, have less in terms of, access to capital. So like people's ability to buy homes, like during the 2008 downturn, most people who lost their house were Black and or Latinx. Like that's just the reality. I know I had more than one family member that lost a house, right? Mm-hmm. So that means that the next generation doesn't get to inherit that wealth, but also doesn't have access to that capital that's been built up in that house, right? Because they got a bad loan and suddenly their interest rate went from this to like this giant amount and they can't afford to keep going. That creates a whole cycle of things. So it's like you have less in general, and you're earning less in general. But yet entrepreneurship is one of the few things that you in some ways can have control over. And so you see that while Silicon Valley has, I call it the tail that wags the dog, because when you're talking about entrepreneurship in this country in the last 10 years or so, everybody talks about Silicon Valley. Like everybody's like, this is the example of entrepreneurship, and here's cover after cover.
The right way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, here's the way it is. But the reality is the biggest growing group of entrepreneurs are Black women and Latinas. So you have this weird disparity in which I was living in of like, I'm seeing all these statistics, I'm seeing all these reports come out. Entrepreneurship in this country overall is down. The few people who are willing to take risks because they have to, some of them, like, it's entrepreneurship not by desire and not by vision, but because this is the only way you can put food on your table, and it's the one thing you can control, because there's no jobs available, because you know that you have a skill set that's, a commercial, like all of these things. And so like that's the part that's difficult to kind of like, there's the systems of like, here's the way that the world is supposed to work, and it might work, but it only works for a certain demographic of people. And here's the realities that a lot of people are living, in which you have to be entrepreneurial, because if you're not, so a lot of people still have that full-time job, but have a side hustle.
Mm-hmm.
And technology overall, like the costs have come down. Like, so if I was to build a sensor sort of MVP today that required $1 million 8 years ago, I could probably do it for 100,000. Between the no code and low code kind of thing, I could probably like cobble together some sort of app that would give me traction. More importantly, there's different business philosophies and ideas and that are part of the conversation now, whether it's the zebra movement, whether it's co-ops, like however you want to talk about it, that makes you realize like, oh, for this project to be financially viable, I don't need a huge inflection of cash. More importantly, what I do need is to make my customers happy. What is the that make my customers happy?
And I think that the something that you're alluding to as well, you have what areas can you make the largest impact on? And when it comes down to like thinking about the wider systemic issues associated with access to capital versus trying to equip the people who are the most driven and for whom it impacts the most, is a much more efficient, method to try and equip, Black and brown founders, rather than trying to convince XYZ VCs to invest in more Black and brown founders. And so
and founders themselves drive the VCs. Like that's
exactly.
Or any sort of like, I don't want to just focus on VC, because VC is a very small slice of
exactly. Yeah. It's overgeneralization. Exactly. But there's this kind of this way of thinking that people fall into things, or they're brilliant and they don't actually have a massive amount of support around them that allow them to get to that place. And because of that, we then develop this myth of like the entrepreneur as this brilliant individual that stands alone, versus acknowledging all of the privilege, but also all of the enablers that allowed them to get to where they were, regardless of what you're focused on. Whereas if people were maybe a bit more honest and open, they'd understand all of the struts that you sit upon, and how for Black and brown people especially, those struts just don't exist. And it's just an interesting dynamic. And Black and brown founders has approached it in a very interesting way. And so also I wanted to ask about COVID and the impact that that's had. Obviously, in general, especially in the United States, Black and brown people have been affected far more so than white people, but not just from the health crisis, but also from the financial crisis and the downturn that's resulted. So I'd love to know what impact has that had on Black and brown founders as an organization, and how you guys have been approaching, everything since then.
Yeah, well, I could say that we as human beings, the team as a whole, we haven't been exempt from the realities that exist. We've gotten sick, we've had family members get sick, we've had family members pass away. It's been extremely painful.
Yeah.
This is not this year. Oh my God, I can't wait for it to be over. I can't wait for the season to be over, because I just want to acknowledge, like, COVID might not be over by the end of 2020. So it's just been a really, really rough year. Having said that, I think we have a great team, and we've been able to kind of like think through what is it that we're doing, and how is it that we're engaging with our communities, because we had this whole vision this year of doing a series of things, and we've managed for the most part to do those things. We've had to pivot in many ways and actually address them head on. For example, we have a bootstrapping bootcamp. It's a 10-week self-paced online course that people can have access to. We have scholarships available, so people can go and check out the bootcamp if they're interested. Anybody can be a part of the bootcamp. It's really been built and created by Ania Williams and Francesca Soto, who is their director of education, thinking through like if you have an idea and you have limited resources, how can you get to your first customer? How is it that you can be thinking about creating and building a tech or tech-enabled business to get to that first customer so that you're thinking about your revenue that you're earning and that helps you get that you want, which is to be financially solvent and financially successful. And so we were able to launch that, and we're really proud of that. And then the second thing that we were planning on doing this year is we wanted to do a series of pop-up events across the U.S. And do an online and in-person event where we would go to a particular city and be able to find Black and or Latinx folks within that city who had expertise, be able to uh, capture their content, broadcast it, and really figure out like what's going on in this particular city and map out the ecosystem that would sustain that city. Well, obviously, traveling is just not a possibility for us, and so that's when we pivoted to go completely virtual, and that's how CHROMA 2020 came to be. HeySummit is been kind of the sponsor, and also it's the platform that we're using to organize all of this. And so we have 50 plus speakers right now, all of them experts in their field, and it's everything from like, if you're a non-technical founder, what are the things that you should be thinking through, to some design principles, to like, how do you get your first customers? How should you be thinking about customer acquisition? To DEI strategies for people to think through. And yes, we do have investors. We have practically a full day around financing and financials and money that's going to be happening. But it's really all of it we've been thinking through of like, people are having a hard time right now. Some people who have never been online, who had a family business or, um, kind of like a mom and pop shop, suddenly had to go online because they've never had to. They've always had customers go through, walk through or come on by, or they have relationships with their customers. Suddenly they have to think through like, what is their online strategy? And then we've had other people who are like, were expecting or had customers that were based upon a different business model suddenly have to like rethink their business model.
Mhm.
Because it could be that that business model doesn't come back. So how is it that they're using tech tools to be still financially viable is something that we're seeing a lot. So a lot of our content is trying to address those things. So when we were kind of curating who's going to speak about what, those are the things that we were thinking through, because we just want to acknowledge this has just been a painful year. But the reality is that a lot of the pain that we're experiencing were cracks before and now have become chasms. These were issues that we had before, but because of COVID, we now realize how big, when we are under siege with something that you cannot control, how that crack can completely become an overarching issue for people. So
Yeah.
whether it's access to healthcare, whether it's that you had an hourly job, whatever structures we have built, and that we have built an economic recovery upon, have really been on the backs of people. And unfortunately, it's been on the backs of Black and or Latinx and Indigenous people who
Yeah.
just honestly just had very little to spare, and now are in situations economically that if we don't do well, this country does not do well.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to see that be a part of the conversation. But we've been seeing and experiencing that for the last, I would say, like 6 months. Because I'm in San Francisco. We were in the first places to shut down,
Yeah.
and so we've been seeing that I think for a little bit longer than other places, but it's been brutal.
And so with CHROMA specifically, what's your vision for it? What are you most excited about? I know that you mentioned a couple types of people that are presenting there, but yeah, what brings you the most excitement? I know that we've already had a couple of comments on here talking about how beautiful it looks, but and wanting some tips about how you all actually have designed it. But yeah, would love to hear kind of what are your hopes for it.
So first of all, if you're interested in the design thing, you should check out Jason Giles' talk. He's our designer. He's amazing. He's on our board of directors, and he's just an amazing designer. Between him and Ania, they came up with a beautiful concept. Ania is very clear that, and she has really taught me this, for which I'm really grateful, is like, we deserve nice things. I think so often when you come from marginalized communities, niceties are something that are a nice to have, but not a necessity. And so that's the part that's important for me right now, is like making sure that people have a really great experience and that come and engage with people that they're learning from, and that they come away with skills. Like I think that inspiration and aspiration is important, but I think skill building is also important. And in the last 10 years, and I keep on saying this because this has been part of my reality, and I'm sure that there will be books written about this era, where skill sets and being able to adapt is being able to adapt and learn new skills is going to be the best skill you can have. It's not what you learn, it's how you learn, right? You could go and study medieval history in Poland right now, and that will be important information for whatever field you want. But the reality is that the skill set that allowed you to learn and study that should be able to be applied for whatever other reason, right? So if you have a need to suddenly be multilingual, how is it that you acquire languages? If you have a need to be able to work with a great amount of people, how is it that you create like an intercultural matrix for yourself so that you can work with people respectfully, regardless of culture or class or religion? Like, how do you do that? Like, that's a skill set. But how you acquire skills are important. So a lot of our work for CHROMA is really about having people come through to it with a learning mindset and trying to learn from all these experts. We're really proud also that we have some folks that are a part of this event that were part of our first boot camp, who have decided to become, I put out a call to our first boot camp of people and said, hey, anybody want to speak at our event? Because it's important for us to engage with people that are part of our communities. Who wants to come and speak? And so we have 3 speakers, Michelle Hayward, Casey Ata, and Canin Carlos, who are all speaking on 3 separate things, but they went through our boot camp, and so I'm really proud of that too. And we also wanted to have geographic diversity, because I want to acknowledge that we're all online right now. You're in a place, I'm in a place, we're interacting. Geography still matters. We have different policies and different systems that we're interacting with. And so we have speakers all the way from London to San Francisco, and 1% in Colombia, and everywhere in between. So having people that are in Detroit, Chicago, Alabama, North Carolina, in Atlanta, Austin, Texas, Denver, like Portland, like that was part of the work too, because we wanted to make sure Boston, New York, LA, San Diego, like we wanted people from all over the place. And because it's important for us to be able to see, like, yes, we are living within different contexts, but sometimes we're dealing with the same system.
Totally.
So folks, then there was a great list that just came out via Twitter, and you might want to check it out, of like some Black folks that are working within tech in London that you all should follow, because that's a very different system, and yet there's a lot of systemic things that are the same regardless of where you are, and we all have to find ways to be able to like dismantle systems and create new systems.
Cool. Well, yeah, it's a beautiful way to end off there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak and for joining us. If anybody would like to connect with you, I think it's okay if they just look you up on LinkedIn. Is that okay?
Yeah, LinkedIn, Deldelp Medina. I'm the only person in the world with this name.
Very cool.
There have been a couple people who've tried to take my name in certain places, but you should know, like, the official channels are the ones that they're really, like, other people are probably just imitating me.
Yeah.
But I want to thank you, actually, before we say goodbye. Like, I want to thank you, and I want to thank your team. I think you're putting together not only a tool that I think is very helpful for people to reach out and engage with each other, but it's allowed us to have like a mutualistic model. Like, 85% of every ticket that you buy through a speaker, that money goes into that speaker's pocket. We made that decision because we realized that people had COVID realities, and that through sponsorships and through other support networks, we were able to pay ourselves. And that we just want to acknowledge that even some of our speakers, like, you might have your reality, but you're connected to other people. And there's a lot of
Totally.
folks right now where it's like, we live in very community oriented ways in which you have to make decisions. Do I help my sister pay her rent because she's lost her job, or do I have her move in with me? Like, this is part of what we're experiencing as a community. And so the mutualistic model and the way that you set up HeySummit has allowed us to do that with ease, where it's not a whole bunch of work on our end. So I just want to thank you and your
I
team
appreciate
for
that.
of like, how do we help people help other people? So check out some of the speakers, check out like some of their profiles, buy tickets through them, use their codes. We want to make sure our speakers are paid and they're being compensated for the work. We always pay our speakers, but this has been a way that in which we ensure that they get access to, that the communities actually support them. And I think
Totally.
like that's a long way in creating a business that's really thinking through like what do customers need. And so I just want to say thank you to
No
your team.
problem. Well, I mean, we're very honored that CHROMA is being hosted on HeySummit. Obviously, we're really excited to see it. But yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. If anybody wants to follow Black and Brown Founders, they're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, and they're on Instagram at BB Founders. And all this talk about CHROMA, it is in the description, the link, but you can also find it at blackandbrownfounders.com/CHROMA. And yeah, it just leaves me to thank everyone who's either watching or listening. Thank you very much for kind of tuning in. And wherever you are in the world, I hope that you're keeping safe, and see you next time, probably next week. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Deldelp.
Bye.
Bye.